So the story begins in April 1940, during a time when World War II was raging across the entire world. At that time, both Germany and Britain were trying to take control of Norway. This very issue sparked a conflict between Germany and Britain. One day, during the war, a British plane and a German plane were engaged in combat. As a result of this battle, a German plane crashed in the middle of the snowy mountains of Norway in a completely deserted area. Out of the 4 German soldiers on board, 1 died in the crash. The soldiers were Lieutenant Schoepus, Strunk, and a young man named Josef. They noticed that Josef had injured his hand during the crash. It was badly cut, so Strunk began treating Josef's wound with medicine. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Schoepus wandered around the area searching for a way out. However, after going a short distance, he fell into a pit that had been made for hunting animals. Strunk and Josef then managed to pull Schoepus out of the pit. After this, the group decided to head toward the sea, hoping to find their army and rejoin the battle. They gathered all the medicines, food, and necessary supplies from the wrecked plane. To walk on the snow, they tied broken parts of the plane to their feet as makeshift snowshoes. Then, after paying respects to their fallen comrade, they set fire to their crashed plane and moved on. Unfortunately, soon after, a severe snowstorm began, making it impossible for them to see anything ahead. Using a compass, they slowly made their way forward. After walking for a while, darkness fell, and they dug a hole in the snow to shelter themselves for the night. Somehow, they survived the night in that pit, and the next morning they started moving again. After walking some distance, Strunk, who was carrying all the essential supplies and food, suddenly slipped and began falling into a ravine. He managed to grab onto some rocks to stop his fall, but there was a problem. The heavy bag of supplies was tied to his waist, preventing him from climbing up. So Lieutenant Schoepus told him to drop the bag. Following his advice, Strunk dropped it and, with great difficulty, climbed out of the ravine. Unfortunately, they had now lost all their food and necessary items. Disheartened and empty-handed, they continued walking until they spotted a small wooden cabin. Seeing it, they were overjoyed. At last, they had found a safe place to escape the extreme cold. The 3 of them quickly entered the cabin, which was empty inside. There were some pillows, blankets, food, and a chimney for lighting a fire. This meant they could safely stay there until the snowstorm outside stopped. Strunk tried to light a fire to warm the cabin, but just then they heard some noises outside. When they went to check, they saw 2 men approaching the cabin, trying to escape the snowstorm. Lieutenant Schoepus asked them who they were and what they were doing there. One of them replied, "My name is Captain Charles, and this is my companion Smith. We are British pilots. Yesterday, during a battle with a German plane, our aircraft crashed on this mountain. Since then, we've been searching for help." Hearing this, Lieutenant Schoepus invited them inside the cabin. Even though they were enemy soldiers, Schoepus decided not to harm them and instead chose to help them. Once inside, the British soldiers noticed there were 2 beds, one in good condition and the other not so much. Charles and Smith decided to take the better bed, but the German soldiers told them that since they arrived first, they would take the good bed. The British soldiers didn't want to agree, so the Germans pulled out their guns and pointed them at the British, saying, "From now on, you are our prisoners of war. You must follow all our orders." In wartime, when a soldier is captured by enemy forces, they are called a prisoner of war. Since Charles and Smith had no weapons, they had no choice but to agree. The German soldiers searched them thoroughly, and in Charles's pocket, they found a lighter. Schoepus kept it for himself. Charles got very angry and said, "That lighter was a gift from my father on my 15th birthday. It's very valuable to me. Give it back." Schoepus replied, "I promise I'll return it to you once we get to safety." While they were talking, Smith tried to snatch the guns from the Germans but failed. Seeing this, Schoepus drew a line down the middle of the cabin and said, "This line is the border between us. From now on, if you want to cross it, you must ask for permission." Left with no choice, Charles and Smith agreed to this condition as well. Meanwhile, outside, a fierce snowstorm had started, making the environment extremely cold. But by now, they had no firewood left to keep the fire going in the cabin, so they began gathering all the unnecessary wooden items from inside the house, and even went as far as completely dismantling the wooden outhouse located outside. At the same time, Joseph's wounded hand had started to become seriously infected, making him increasingly weak. Lieutenant Chopus applied medicine to the wound and re-bandaged it. Seeing all this, Charles crossed the dividing line inside the cabin to try and help Joseph by checking his injury. But the German soldiers pushed him back across the line and said, "Didn't we tell you that you're not allowed to cross this line without our permission?" Charles laughed and replied, "I was just trying to help." A little while later, food was cooked and served to all the soldiers. But the problem was that there was only one table in the cabin. The German soldiers sat at the table to eat, while the British soldiers were made to sit on the floor. Seeing this, Charles protested, "I won't tolerate this insult. We are British Air Force pilots, and we deserve to eat at the same table as you." Hearing this, Lieutenant Chopus agreed and moved the table so that it was placed directly on top of the line that divided the room. Then all of them, dressed in their respective military uniforms, ate together with mutual respect. After the meal, they had nothing else to do, so everyone sat quietly on their beds. Observing this, Lieutenant Chopus said, "Since we won't be able to go outside for the next few days because of the snowstorm, I think we should pass the time by talking to each other." Everyone agreed to the idea. They began discussing their favorite things in their families. From these conversations, they learned that Strunk came from a very wealthy family that owned a factory employing 2,000 workers. Yet, despite his background, he chose to serve his country in the war. On the other hand, Joseph had no family at all. He was entirely alone. As they kept talking late into the night, Joseph's wounds started hurting badly again. Seeing this, Charles said, "Your compass contains quite a bit of alcohol. If you use it to clean Joseph's wound, the infection might get better." Hearing this, Chopus immediately broke open the compass and used the alcohol inside it to clean Joseph's wound. But now, having destroyed the compass, they had no way of determining directions anymore. So they placed a small magnet on a thin piece of wood and floated it on water to create a makeshift compass, using it to determine direction. After somehow making it through the night, the next morning the German soldiers decided to leave the cabin. However, a severe snowstorm was still raging outside. Seeing this, Charles said, "I don't think it's a good idea for us to go out in such terrible weather." Chopus replied, "All our food is gone, and we've run out of firewood to keep the place warm. In this situation, it's not possible for us to survive here much longer. We have no choice. We must leave now." With that, everyone stepped out of the cabin and began heading toward a safer place. But the freezing, stormy winds made it extremely difficult to move forward. The blizzard had reduced visibility so much that they could barely see anything. After going a short distance, Joseph collapsed in the snow, too ill to continue. While trying to help him, Strunk also fell behind, and the two of them became separated from the group. Meanwhile, Chopus, Charles, and Smith moved much farther ahead. After a while, they looked back and realized that Joseph and Strunk were missing. They began shouting their names, trying to search for them, but the snowstorm made it impossible to see or hear anything around them. With no other choice, the three of them returned to the cabin, only to find that Joseph and Strunk were already there waiting for them. Now they all decided that they would stay inside the cabin until the weather outside improved. But by then they had run out of all their food, so they were forced to gather grass from beneath the snow outside, boil it in water, and eat it. While they were eating, Smith started joking around with Joseph. Since the two were the same age, Smith would often tease Joseph and joke with him whenever he had the chance. But this time, the joking escalated into a bit of a scuffle. Lieutenant Chopus and the others quickly intervened and broke up the fight. Shortly afterward, when Smith went outside to relieve himself, he saw a herd of deer passing near their cabin. He immediately thought that if they could hunt just one of them, it would solve their food problem for the next few days. So he quickly called everyone to come outside, but by the time they got out, the deer had already left. After returning to the cabin, Smith returned a book to Joseph, one that Joseph cherished deeply because it had Hitler's signature in it. He always kept it safely with him. But Smith had secretly stolen the book and used several of its pages as toilet paper. Upon discovering this, Joseph became furious and tried to shoot Smith, but Chopus and Strunk quickly stopped him and prevented him from doing it. Frustrated and angry, Joseph threw his gun to the floor. Taking advantage of the situation, Smith shoved everyone aside, grabbed the gun from the floor, and then pointed it at Joseph's head. He also ordered Chopus and Strunk to drop their weapons. Left with no choice, they complied. In an instant, the power dynamic had flipped, and now the British soldiers had full control. After taking all the weapons from the Germans, Charles and Smith declared that from now on, they would sleep in the good beds, and the Germans would take the bad ones. Scopas pleaded, saying that Joseph's condition was very serious and that they should be allowed to use the good bed. But Charles refused to listen. That night, with no food left, everyone suffered in hunger. The next morning, Smith and Strunk went outside to hunt. After searching for a while, they spotted a rabbit in the distance. Strunk suggested they approach from two sides and trap it. But before he could even finish speaking, Smith took a shot from a distance and killed the rabbit. Impressed by Smith's aim, Strunk praised him highly. Slowly, the two began to develop a strong friendship. Back inside the cabin, they had burned almost everything they could to keep warm. Now Charles noticed a long wooden support beam running from the floor to the ceiling. He told Scopas to break it. Scopas protested, saying that the beam was supporting the roof and that if it was removed, the roof would collapse. But Charles didn't listen and insisted. As Scopas feared, the moment the beam was broken, the ceiling began to cave in. Charles and Scopas climbed onto a table and held up the collapsing roof with their hands. While holding it up, Scopas became emotional. He confessed, "I'm a terrible pilot. I once crashed a plane before and was sent to jail. But then World War II started and I was released in order to return to duty. And now I've crashed again. Because of me, one of our comrades died and Joseph got injured." Saying this, he broke down and started crying. Meanwhile, Smith and Strunk returned and saw Charles and Scopas struggling to hold up the roof. They quickly helped put the broken beam back into place. After this incident, they all agreed that as long as they were staying together, they would forget their enmity and live as friends. To prove this, they took all the guns and placed them outside the cabin. Then they cooked the rabbit they had hunted and enjoyed a hearty meal together. But by now, Joseph's condition had worsened severely. The infection in his wounded hand had become so bad that it was giving off a terrible smell. Seeing this, Charles said that gangrene had set in and Joseph would die if they didn't act quickly. However, it was impossible for them to take him to a hospital, so they decided that they had no choice but to amputate his hand. If they didn't, the infection would spread through his body and he would surely die. They planned to sterilize an axe with boiling water and use it to amputate the infected hand. But to make the water boil, they needed more firewood. So they pried up planks from the cabin floor and began burning them. While doing so, they discovered a box hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside, they found several bottles of liquor and some dried meat. Everyone was overjoyed. They gave Joseph a heavy dose of alcohol to knock him out. Then, just as they were about to cut his hand with the axe, Joseph suddenly regained consciousness. Seeing Scopas with the axe in hand, he panicked and began to struggle. Smith had to punch him unconscious again. Then Scopas used the axe to amputate Joseph's infected hand and threw it outside. After that, everyone ate heartily and sat down together to drink. By this time, they had all formed strong bonds of friendship. They shared stories, sang songs, and danced, enjoying their time together despite the war and suffering outside. Meanwhile, the Norwegian army had learned that a German and a British plane had crashed in their country's mountains, so they began searching for the wrecks and the soldiers involved. The next morning, when Joseph regained consciousness, he was horrified to see his amputated hand. He was completely disoriented and unable to comprehend what had happened. Scopas calmly explained everything to him, that if they hadn't done this, he might have died, and they were forced to do it to save his life. Hearing this, Joseph broke down and cried in pain and sorrow. Then everyone stepped outside and saw that the snowstorm had finally stopped, and the surroundings were peaceful once more. Now they could begin their journey back towards civilization. Smith and Strunk decided they would go ahead a little and find a safe path out of the area. Meanwhile, Scopas and Charles would work together to build a sled for Joseph, since he was too weak to walk long distances on his own. According to the plan, Smith and Strunk moved far ahead and climbed a tall mountain. From there, they found a path that could lead them back to their base camp. Smith said, "We'll all go forward along this route. If we spot a British camp, you three will take a different route and escape. But if it's a German camp, Charles and I will escape." Saying this, they turned back toward the cabin. Meanwhile, the Norwegian soldiers who had been searching for them arrived in the mountains. From a distance, they spotted Smith and Strunk. One of the Norwegian snipers fired and killed Strunk on sight. But they didn't harm Smith. They arrested him since he was a British soldier and Norway was allied with Britain in this war. Witnessing Strunk's death, Smith was devastated. The Norwegian soldiers then used Smith to locate Scopas, Joseph, and Charles. They captured all of them and brought them back to the Norwegian Army's base camp. There, the Norwegian officers interrogated Charles and Smith, asking, "What were you doing for all these days, living in the same cabin with German soldiers? If we find out that you made friends with them, we will report this to your country's military and you will be severely punished." Charles responded, "We were just trying to survive in the middle of that terrible snowstorm. That's all. We didn't form any kind of friendship with them." As they were talking, Lieutenant Scopas entered and returned the lighter to Charles, the same lighter he had taken from him on the very first day. Later, Scopas and Joseph were sent by boat to another base camp. They had officially become prisoners of war under Norwegian custody. As for Charles and Smith, a report of everything they had done was prepared, and then they were released. Outside, they saw Joseph and Scopas on the boat in the distance. The four of them looked at each other and exchanged gentle smiles. In the end, we are told that Scopas and Joseph were kept in a Canadian prison as prisoners of war for the next 7 years. A few days later, Charles and Smith returned to the battlefield. But during a mission, their plane crashed once again. This time, Smith died, and Charles was captured by the Germans and held as a prisoner of war in a German prison. Many years later, in 1977, Charles unexpectedly called Scopas and invited him to his home in London. Scopas agreed and visited him, and that's how, until the end of their lives, Charles and Scopas remained very close friends. With that, the movie story ends. That's it for today's video. Let us know in the comments how you liked it. If you enjoyed it, give it a like. If not, feel free to dislike. We'll see you again in the next video.